You really think this is a good idea, Em? Mark whispered, his hand finding mine under the table, his thumb tracing worried circles. His gaze flicked towards the massive ballroom doors, then back to me, his brow furrowed with the concern that only someone who had witnessed the full, unadulterated circus of my family could possess. He knew the stakes. He knew what they'd said. He knew the email. The air in the reception area was thick with the faint scent of stale potpourri, and generations of unspoken resentments, a signature aroma of any gathering involving my particular brand of kin. I just smiled, a thin, almost brittle line that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Oh, it's not just a good idea, Mark," I murmured, my voice barely audible above the polite hum of early arrivals. "It's the only idea." And with that, I pushed back my chair, every movement deliberate, every breath a quiet act of defiance. The next 5 hours would either be my greatest triumph or a public immolation. Either way, I was ready for the fire. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. My family. Where do I even begin? It's less a family tree and more a tangled, overgrown kudzu vine, slowly suffocating everything in its path. For years, I was the resident landscaper, trimming back the toxic growth, patching up the cracks, and generally trying to keep the whole ramshackle structure from collapsing. I was Emma, the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who always showed up, always helped out, always put everyone else's needs before her own. If there was a crisis, I was the first call. If there was a bill no one else wanted to pay, my name was on the check. If a relative needed a place to crash for just a few days that inevitably turned into months, my spare room was magically available. It was never asked, only expected, and like a well-trained dog, I performed. For a long time, I genuinely believed it was my duty, my role in the grand theatrical production of the Miller family. My mother, Eleanor, perfected the art of the helpless sigh, capable of conveying a lifetime of hardship with a single breath. My father, Richard, was the benevolent dictator, whose generosity came with invisible strings attached, always pulling you back into his orbit. And my older brother, Leo. Leo was the golden child, the sun around whom our entire dysfunctional solar system revolved. He could do no wrong, even when he did everything wrong. His failures were always someone else's fault, usually mine, or the result of some cosmic injustice. His triumphs, however minor, were celebrated with fanfare usually reserved for national holidays. My earliest memories are steeped in this dynamic. I remember being about 7, Leo was 9. He'd broken a lamp in the living room while roughhousing, something loud and ceramic. My parents, instead of reprimanding him, immediately started questioning me. "Emma, were you distracting your brother? Why were you two playing so roughly?" I tried to explain, tried to tell them Leo had pushed me, but their eyes glazed over. "He's just a boy, Emma. You're older. You should know better." 2 years older, they meant, but somehow that made me responsible for his destructive impulses. It was a pattern that would repeat itself, endlessly. When Leo needed money for a new business venture, which inevitably fizzled into nothing but debt, I was subtly pressured to lend him my savings. When he failed out of college, I was encouraged to pick up extra shifts to help with his transition period. My achievements were met with polite nods, occasionally a, "That's nice, dear," before the conversation swung back to Leo's latest drama or triumph. "You always do so well, Emma," my mother would coo. "It's just Leo we worry about." It felt less like a compliment and more like a dismissive wave of the hand, a quiet assurance that my stable existence was simply the baseline, a foundation for their real focus, Leo. It was exhausting, living in his shadow, constantly bracing for the next emergency, the next expectation. It was like being the designated driver at a demolition derby, forever dodging chaos but never truly part of the thrilling destruction, just the one cleaning up the shattered remains. The insidious part was how they normalized it. They'd say, "That's just family, Emma. We stick together." Or, "You're so strong, you can handle anything." These weren't affirmations. They were justifications for their own inaction, their own selfishness. My strength became their excuse to dump their emotional and financial baggage squarely on my shoulders. I saw friends drift away, relationships suffer, hobbies fall by the wayside because there was always a family obligation, a crisis that only Emma could fix. I was boiling like a frog, the water temperature rising so slowly, I didn't even notice I was being cooked alive, until it was almost too late. The family reunions were the worst. They were annual showcases of this dynamic, a forced congregation, where the unwritten rules of our family were reinforced through performative affection and thinly veiled jabs. My worth was directly tied to my utility. The greater the sacrifice, the louder the praise, which felt less like genuine appreciation and more like a dog whistle for the next demand. It was a vicious cycle, one I didn't realize I was trapped in until Mark came along and, with gentle persistence, started pointing out the steam rising from my pot. Mark, bless his observant, calm heart, was the first real crack in their carefully constructed facade. We'd been dating for about 6 months when he joined me for a particularly grueling family dinner. It was a birthday celebration for my mother, and the atmosphere was thick with the usual passive aggression. My aunt, always the instigator, made a pointed comment about my single life, despite knowing I was with Mark. My mother sighed dramatically about Leo's latest failed investment, conveniently forgetting the $5,000 she'd loaned him that year was money I'd quietly covered. I smiled, nodded, deflected, and changed the subject. A lifetime of practice making me an Olympic-level conversational gymnast. Later that night, back in the quiet sanctuary of my apartment, Mark turned to me, his expression serious. "Emma," he began, "I love your family, truly. They're something. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "did you notice how every conversation somehow circled back to Leo? Or to what you could do for someone?" I scoffed, waving it off. "Oh, that's just how they are. It's fine." But a seed was planted. It was a tiny, inconvenient seed, but it was there, germinating in the fertile ground of my long-suppressed exhaustion. Mark didn't push. That was his genius. He simply observed, quietly. Over the next few months, he accompanied me to more family events, watched me navigate the minefield of expectations, and listened patiently to my post-event debriefs, which were often a mix of venting and immediate guilt for venting. He'd simply say, "It sounds like you're doing a lot of emotional heavy lifting, Em." Or, "Do you feel appreciated for all that you do?" Each question was a gentle probe, not accusatory, but genuinely curious, designed to make me consider what I had always dismissed as normal. The biggest eye-opener came during Christmas. My parents had decided on a secret Santa with a strict 50 limit. I, of course, spent weeks finding the perfect, thoughtful gifts for everyone, adhering to the limit. Leo, on the other hand, gave my father a half-eaten box of chocolates he'd clearly regifted from someone else, and my mother a crumpled, obviously last-minute gift card to a store she hated. The kicker? My parents raved about Leo's thoughtfulness, while my mother, unwrapping the meticulously chosen scarf I'd given her, merely said, "Oh, a scarf. You always do get me scarves, Emma." The implicit message was clear. My effort was expected. His minimal gesture was celebrated, as if it were a grand sacrifice. Mark saw my expression, the tiny flicker of hurt I tried to hide. Later, he just held me. "You deserve more than crumbs, Em." His validation was like sunlight after years of living in a cave. He made me see that the peace I was keeping was actually just me suppressing my own needs, my own voice. The boundaries I thought I had were transparent, easily breached. I started saying no, small no's at first. "No, I can't babysit Leo's kids on Saturday. I have plans." The shock on their faces was palpable. My mother tried the sigh. My father tried the benevolent dictator act. "Emma, it's just a small favour." But Mark had taught me a mantra. No is a complete sentence, and it was liberating. The backlash was immediate and fierce. They accused me of being selfish, of changing, of abandoning my family. My mother called, crying, accusing me of breaking her heart. Leo texted, "What's your problem, Em?" We used to be close. The guilt, a familiar, unwelcome guest, tried to creep back in, but this time, Mark was there, a solid wall against their emotional manipulation. He reminded me of all the times they'd taken advantage, all the times I'd been overlooked. He was my anchor, pulling me back from the undertow of their toxic narrative. It was a slow, painful awakening, but with each small battle, I felt a little stronger, a little more myself. I wasn't Emma the doormat anymore. I was just Emma, and Emma was learning to stand her ground. The final straw wasn't a single event, but a slow, agonizing, unraveling, a testament to their unwavering commitment to self-preservation at my expense. It involved the family cabin. A rustic, beautiful place my grandparents had built, nestled deep in the woods, the kind of place filled with childhood memories that were increasingly tainted by adult realities. My grandparents had passed away a few years prior, and the cabin, rather than being a shared sanctuary, became another battleground for my parents and Leo. I had always been the one maintaining it, fixing the leaky roof, clearing fallen trees, managing the utilities, even paying a good portion of the property taxes when my parents would forget or claim financial hardship. Leo, meanwhile, treated it like a free vacation rental, leaving messes, breaking things, and never contributing a dime. "It's family, Emma," my mother would say whenever I brought it up. "Leo's going through a tough time." Tough time, apparently, meant a perpetual state of financial insolvency and a complete lack of personal responsibility. Then came the grand plan. My parents decided they wanted to sell the cabin. I was devastated. It was the one place that felt like a true connection to my grandparents, untainted by the immediate family's drama. But they insisted it was too much work for them, too financially burdensome. I offered to buy them out, to take on full ownership and responsibility. I had savings, earned through years of diligent work and frugal living, precisely because I wasn't constantly bailing out a ne'er-do-well brother or subsidizing my parents' lavish lifestyle. My offer was fair, based on an independent appraisal. They seemed to consider it, for a moment, and I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, finally, they would see my dedication, my investment, my desire to preserve something truly meaningful. That flicker died a swift, brutal death. My parents, after weeks of vague responses and evasions, finally called me for a family meeting. Mark was there with me, a silent, comforting presence. The meeting was a masterclass in gaslighting. My mother started with teary-eyed pronouncements about how much they loved me, how I was such a good daughter. My father, ever the strategist, spoke of Leo's potential and how this sale would finally give him the fresh start he needed. The fresh start, it turned out, involved selling the cabin, not to me, but to a developer who wanted to tear it down and build McMansions, and giving Leo a significant portion of the proceeds to invest in his next doomed venture. My share? A measly fraction, less than half of what I'd contributed in maintenance and taxes over the years, barely a recognition of my efforts. "It's only fair, Emma," my father explained, his voice oozing false concern. "Leo needs it more. You're so good with money, you'll be fine." I stared at them, my vision blurring with a sudden, overwhelming wave of betrayal. It was a physical blow. All those years, all those sacrifices, all that keeping the peace, it had all been for nothing. I was not seen as a valued member of the family, but as a resource to be exploited, then discarded when no longer convenient. Leo, the endless void of need, was once again prioritized. I remember the silence that followed my father's pronouncement. It was so profound it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on me. Mark's hand, which had been resting on my knee, tightened almost imperceptibly, a silent anchor in the storm raging inside me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rage. I wanted to ask how they could possibly justify such a blatant act of favoritism and disregard, but a strange calm settled over me instead. It was the calm of pure, unadulterated indignation. For decades, I had allowed myself to be boiled, slowly, gently, until I was cooked through. But this was them pulling me out of the pot, dropping me into an ice bath, and then having the audacity to tell me I should be grateful for the shock. My voice, when it came, was surprisingly steady, devoid of the tremor I felt deep within. "So," I said, looking from my father to my mother, "all those years I poured my time, my money, my energy into that cabin, into this family. It was just to pave the way for Leo to squander yet another handout." My mother flinched, her eyes darting away. My father bristled, his face reddening. "Emma, that's not fair. You always dramatize things." "Dramatic?" I echoed, a wry, almost bitter laugh escaping me. "No, father. This is simple accounting, and the ledger is heavily skewed against me." I stood up, the chair scraping loudly on the hardwood floor, a harsh sound in the tense quiet. "You know what? Keep your pittance. I don't want it. Consider it the final payment for my decades of services as your unpaid assistant, emotional punching bag, and financial lifeline for Leo." My mother started to protest. Something about how I was ruining Christmas, even though it was July. Leo, who had been conspicuously silent throughout, finally piped up. "Emma, you're being ridiculous. It's just a cabin." "Just a cabin?" I shot back, my gaze fixed on him. "It was our grandparents' legacy, Leo. Something you never lifted a finger to maintain, but you're perfectly happy to profit from its destruction." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Mark finally spoke, his voice low and firm. "Emma's right. This isn't just about a cabin. It's about a pattern of behavior." My parents looked genuinely shocked that he dared to speak. They had always treated him as an amiable accessory, easily ignored. That meeting was the turning point. After that, the communications from my parents became sporadic and tinged with resentment. The usual guilt trips escalated into outright accusations. My mother, in one particularly venomous phone call, informed me that I was no longer part of the family. In the same breath, she asked if I could proofread Leo's resume. The irony was so thick it was almost comedic. Leo, predictably, fell silent, probably hoping I'd just disappear and stop being an inconvenient reminder of his endless privilege. I didn't disappear. Instead, I focused on myself, on my career, on my relationship with Mark. We bought a small, cozy house, one I paid for entirely, with my money. The money I hadn't wasted bailing out a useless brother. We planned our wedding. Life, untethered from their toxic gravitational pull, began to bloom. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and utterly liberating. My strength wasn't being used as their crutch anymore. It was building my own future. Then came the invitation. A thick, cream-coloured envelope, embossed with a fancy crest, that probably cost more than Leo's last investment. It was for the annual family reunion, but this year it was a grand, catered affair at a country club, marking my father's 60th birthday, and, I presumed, a celebration of their newfound financial liquidity from the cabin sale. My name wasn't on it, Mark's wasn't either. It was addressed only to the Miller family, followed by a handwritten note on a separate card, slipped inside, from my mother. "Emma, darling, we thought it best if you didn't come. Things are still a little raw. We don't want any drama." The sheer audacity of it. They disinherited me, then told me I wasn't welcome at their party, citing drama they had entirely created. My blood ran cold, then boiled. Mark saw the look on my face. "What is it, Em?" I tossed him the card. He read it, then looked at me, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. "So," he said, his eyes sparkling with mischief, "they told you weren't welcome. What are we doing about it?" What were we doing about it? The question hung in the air, shimmering with possibility. For years, my responses to their manipulations had been reactive. I'd withdraw, I'd stew, I'd eventually cave. This time, however, something was different. Mark's question wasn't laced with judgment or expectation, but genuine curiosity and a hint of shared defiance. It was as if he was asking, how are we going to craft our masterpiece of vindication? The feeling that welled up inside me wasn't anger, not entirely. It was a cold, calculated clarity. A plan began to form, not born of malice, but of a desperate need for recognition, for justice, for the truth to be laid bare. This wasn't about revenge. It was about exposing the charade, pulling back the curtain on the great Miller family performance. "We're going," I said, the words a quiet promise to myself. Mark's smile widened, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Oh, this is going to be good." His unwavering support was my secret weapon. He didn't try to talk me out of it, didn't question the morality of my intent. He simply understood. He had witnessed the slow, insidious gaslighting, the decades of emotional and financial exploitation, the ultimate betrayal with the cabin. He knew this wasn't an act of petty spite, but the culmination of a lifetime of suppressed hurt. We spent the next few weeks meticulously planning, not in a cloak and dagger, villainous way, but in the methodical manner of two people preparing for a very important presentation, where the audience desperately needed to hear the uncomfortable truth. We discussed what I would say, what documents I would need, how I would maintain composure. Mark, with his pragmatic nature, even suggested a contingency plan for every conceivable reaction from my family. The date of the reunion loomed, a red circle on my calendar that pulsed with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. I bought a new dress, something elegant and understated, designed to convey quiet confidence rather than flashy defiance. I wanted to look like someone who had moved on, someone who was thriving, someone who certainly wasn't there to cause a scene. At least, not initially. The day itself dawned crisp and clear, almost mockingly perfect. My stomach fluttered with nerves, but beneath that, a steely resolve had solidified. Mark, ever the rock, made us a calming breakfast and played my favourite upbeat music. "Remember," he said as we left the house, "you're not here to win their approval. You're here to set your story straight." His words resonated, grounding me. We arrived at the country club precisely when the reunion was in full swing. The parking lot was packed with familiar cars, each one a tiny capsule of a past I was determined to shed. The grand ballroom was buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the usual cacophony of relatives who hadn't seen each other in a year, and whose conversations consisted mostly of superficial updates and thinly veiled gossip. As we stepped through the double doors, the air seemed to thicken, the noise to dampen. Heads turned, conversations faltered. A ripple of recognition, then astonishment, swept through the room. My mother, who was holding court by the buffet table, froze mid-gesture, her teacup rattling precariously. My father, deep in conversation with a golf buddy, snapped his head up, his eyes widening in disbelief. And Leo, leaning against the bar, nursing a drink, literally choked on his cocktail. It was everything I had anticipated, and more. I walked straight, my chin up, a polite, almost serene smile on my face, Mark a solid presence at my side. The silence that followed our entrance was deafening, the kind where you could practically hear everyone's internal monologue screeching to a halt. This was my hook. This was my in media res opening, and the story was just beginning. The silence, though brief, felt like an eternity. It was punctuated only by the distant clinking of cutlery and the rhythmic beat of my own heart. My mother, Eleanor, recovered first, her face twisting into that familiar mask of injured innocence. "Emma?" she uttered, her voice a high-pitched gasp, as if I were a ghost risen from the grave rather than her own flesh and blood. "What are you doing here?" Her question was loaded, not with genuine confusion, but with an underlying accusation, a blatant disregard for the truth of her own actions. I met her gaze, keeping my expression neutral, almost empathetic. "Well, Mother," I replied, my voice clear and calm, cutting through the stunned murmurs that were beginning to spread. "It's a family reunion, isn't it? And last I checked, I am part of the family. Or at least, I used to be." The quiet challenge in my tone landed like a feather, barely noticed by some, but a sharp dart to those who truly understood the subtext. My father, Richard, ever the politician, quickly stepped forward, attempting to control the narrative. "Emma, darling, we just thought... Well, we sent you a note. Things have been a bit tense, and we wanted to avoid any unpleasantness." He gestured vaguely, his eyes scanning the room, clearly worried about appearances. Unpleasantness, I repeated, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on my lips. Father, do you mean the unpleasantness of me finding out you sold our grandparents' cabin? The cabin I poured years of my life and a significant amount of my own money into, to fund Leo's latest business venture, while offering me a pittance? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Several aunts and uncles, who had previously been smiling awkwardly, now looked genuinely alarmed. Leo, who had finally regained his composure, took a step forward, his jaw tight. Emma, don't you dare! This is Dad's birthday, and you're ruining it. Am I, Leo? I asked, turning my full attention to him, my gaze unwavering. Or am I merely shedding light on the family's preferred method of operation? The collective gasp from the room was almost audible. It was a direct hit, and he visibly recoiled. He was used to my quiet acquiescence, not this open defiance. My mother's face was now a mask of horror, alternating between looking at me and looking at the stunned faces of her siblings and cousins. This wasn't how her perfect family tableau was supposed to look. This was supposed to be a triumph, a showcase of their success, built on the very sacrifices I was now exposing. Mark, still by my side, simply squeezed my hand, a silent affirmation. He was my calm in this gathering storm. I knew I had their attention. The nervous chatter had completely ceased. Every eye in the ballroom was fixed on me, a curious mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning realization. This was the moment. This was where I pulled back the curtain, piece by agonizing piece, on the lifetime of manipulation and exploitation I had endured. It was time to tell my story, not just to them, but to everyone who had ever witnessed their facade of familial harmony. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I simply let the words fall, one by one, into the stunned silence of the room. You know, for years, I listened. I listened to how important family was. I listened to how we stick together. I listened to how I was so strong and could handle anything. I paused, letting the bitter irony hang in the air. What I didn't realize until much, much later was that family meant Emma is here to clean up our messes. Sticking together meant Emma will always be there to bail us out, and strong meant Emma can carry all our burdens because she won't complain. My mother made a small, choked sound, her hand flying to her chest as if in physical pain. My father, usually so composed, looked utterly flustered, glancing around for an escape route that wasn't there. Leo was fuming, his face a mottled red. Let's talk about the cabin, I continued, my voice steady, almost conversational, as if discussing a recent grocery trip. Our grandparents' cabin. The one I spent every summer of my childhood at. The one that held so many cherished memories. When they passed, it became too much for my parents. So, I stepped in. For years, I paid the taxes, covered repairs, spent weekends fixing plumbing, clearing land, making sure it was habitable. I looked directly at a few of my aunts and uncles who had visited the cabin over the years, their expressions shifting from surprise to something akin to understanding. They had seen me there, working. And when my parents decided they wanted to sell it, to a developer no less, who plans to tear it down, I offered to buy it, at market value, because I wanted to preserve it, for our family, for our memories. I let that sink in. The contrast between my desire to preserve and their willingness to destroy for profit. But no, I continued, a faint, humorless smile touching my lips. That wasn't the plan. The plan was to sell it to an outside party, take the bulk of the money, and then hand over a significant portion to Leo. I gestured towards my brother, who now looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Leo, who had never contributed a dime to its upkeep, who treated it like a free hotel, who even managed to break the septic system on one memorable occasion, leaving me to deal with the messy aftermath. All so he could have a fresh start with another ill-conceived business venture. The word ill-conceived hung in the air, echoing all of Leo's past failures that many in the room were undoubtedly aware of. Some of the younger cousins exchanged knowing glances. This wasn't just my private grievance. It was an open secret among those who paid attention. My share? I asked, my voice laced with a bitter laugh. A fraction of what I put in. A literal pittance, offered with the condescending assurance that I'm so good with money. I'll be fine. As if my financial stability was a flaw, something to be penalized, while Leo's perpetual irresponsibility was a virtue to be rewarded. My mother finally found her voice, a strangled whisper. Emma, that's private. This is not the place for this. Private. I shot back, my eyes flashing, the first real sign of the deep-seated anger bubbling beneath my calm exterior. You made it public when you systematically exploited me, then disinherited me, and then had the audacity to tell me I wasn't welcome at your family reunion. You want to talk about raw? That's raw, Mother. And now, everyone gets to hear just how raw things truly are. The room buzzed with a rising tide of whispers. This was no longer just a family spat, it was a full-blown exposé. The whispers escalated, a low, buzzing hum that filled the ballroom. My mother, seeing her carefully constructed facade crumbling, turned to my father, her eyes wide with panic. "Richard, do something!" she hissed, though her voice was still loud enough to carry. My father, however, seemed to be short-circuiting. He stammered, tried to clear his throat, but no words came out. He was out of his element, stripped of his usual power in a public forum. Do something. I interjected, stepping slightly forward, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of my relatives. He can't do something, Mother, because the truth is inconvenient. The truth is messy, and the truth, it turns out, is a bit like a bad odor. It eventually escapes, no matter how many perfumed words you try to spray over it. The cynical humor, a coping mechanism refined over years of absurdity, was a release valve for the tension. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, quickly suppressed. This isn't just about the cabin. I continued, moving slowly, deliberately, as if I were giving a TED talk on family dysfunction. That was merely the most recent, most blatant betrayal. No, this pattern goes back decades, to when Leo would break something and I'd be blamed, to when I spent my own meager savings on textbooks, while Leo's tuition was miraculously covered, despite him never actually attending classes. To every Christmas, every birthday, where my thoughtful, carefully chosen gifts were met with a polite nod, and Leo's last-minute, regifted junk was hailed as genius. I saw a flicker of recognition in the eyes of my Aunt Carol, who always bought my mother expensive, tasteful scarves, only to have them disappear into the back of her closet, while a hideous, hand-knitted monstrosity from Leo was displayed prominently. She knew. They all knew, deep down. And let's not forget the emotional labor, I said, a bitter edge entering my voice. The countless hours spent listening to Leo's woes, convincing him to get a job, trying to mediate his endless dramas with girlfriends and landlords. The constant need to soothe my mother's anxieties, to talk my father down from his latest crisis, which inevitably involved Leo. I was the family therapist, the financial advisor, the free babysitter, the personal assistant, all unpaid, of course. All under the guise of family loyalty. I paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. My loyalty, it seems, was a one-way street. A resource to be depleted, not reciprocated. Leo suddenly surged forward, his face contorted with fury. "You manipulative bitch! You're making this all up! This is for attention!" My eyes narrowed. "Attention, Leo? Is that what you think this is?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that still carried throughout the silent room. "No, Leo. This is about accountability. This is about decades of emotional and financial abuse finally coming to light. You and our parents operated under a transactional definition of family. You took, and I gave. And when I finally tried to set a boundary, tried to say no to your endless demands, I was disinvited. I was told I wasn't welcome. I held up the folded card with my mother's scrawled note. This is what you sent me. We don't want any drama. The absolute audacity." A nervous cough broke the silence from the back of the room. My mother looked utterly defeated, her shoulders slumping. My father seemed to shrink before my eyes. The facade was not just cracked, it was shattering into a million pieces. And I wasn't done yet. I watched them, my parents and Leo, their faces a tableau of shock, indignation, and finally, dawning horror as they realized the extent of their public humiliation. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, where they were both the drivers and the spectators. You talk about drama, I continued, my voice gaining a certain righteous power. But let's be clear about where the drama truly originates. It's not from the person who finally speaks their truth. It's from the deception, the favoritism, the endless gaslighting that led to this moment. I looked around the room, making eye contact with various relatives. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others, particularly my mother's side of the family, seemed to nod almost imperceptibly, as if this was merely confirming suspicions they'd harboured for years. My entire life I have been told that I'm being dramatic or sensitive whenever I voiced a legitimate grievance. I explained, drawing on the years of therapy that had helped me dismantle their twisted narratives. It's a classic tactic, isn't it? When you can't refute the facts, you attack the messenger. You dismiss their feelings. You make them question their own reality. I glanced at Mark, who gave me a subtle nod of encouragement. But thanks to some very clear-headed people in my life, I stopped questioning myself. I started seeing things for what they truly were. Not misunderstandings, not quirks, but deliberate patterns of exploitation. The collective understanding in the room grew, a palpable shift in energy. They weren't just hearing my story. They were connecting it to their own experiences, their own family dynamics, perhaps even their own moments of being gaslit. And now, here we are, I said, sweeping my hand to encompass the extravagant ballroom, the glittering decorations. A grand reunion to celebrate a successful year, funded in part by the destruction of a cherished family legacy and the deliberate exclusion of someone who dared to challenge the status quo. You tried to sweep me under the rug, to pretend I didn't exist, to carry on with your perfect little charade. My voice hardened, tinged with sarcasm. But I decided to show up, not because I crave your approval or your acceptance, but because the truth needed to be heard. Not just for me, but for anyone else in this family who has ever felt overlooked, undervalued, or manipulated. The implications of that statement hung in the air. I wasn't just speaking for myself. I was giving voice to the unspoken grievances of others. It was an invitation, a subtle call to arms for anyone who had ever felt the sting of their particular brand of love. My father finally found his voice, a strained, hoarse whisper. "Emma, please, this is enough." "Enough? Enough?" I scoffed. "No, father, it's not enough. It's barely scratching the surface of the decades of emotional blackmail, the financial drain, the constant invalidation. You told me I wasn't welcome. You tried to erase me from the family narrative because I refused to play the victim anymore. But here I am. And I'm not going anywhere until my story is told, in full, for everyone to hear." I saw a few guests, brave or perhaps just nosy, pull out their phones, pretending to check messages but subtly recording. The story was spreading, and I was just getting warmed up. The indignation, once a burning ember, had now erupted into a full-blown inferno, fueled by years of silent suffering and a fierce desire for vindication. The room was a kaleidoscope of reactions. My parents and Leo were trapped, their faces alternating between fury and a desperate, hunted look. Other relatives were a mix of shocked silence, hushed whispers, and a few outright stares of morbid curiosity. My Aunt Susan, a notorious gossip, looked like Christmas had come early, her eyes sparkling with unholy delight. "Let's talk about the golden child phenomenon," I declared, my voice cutting through the remaining murmurs. Every family has one, don't they? The one who can do no wrong, whose failures are always reframed as learning experiences, whose minimal efforts are lauded as monumental achievements. In our family, that's Leo. I gestured towards him, a conductor introducing his reluctant, humiliated soloist. Leo actually growled, a low, frustrated sound. From scraped knees to failed businesses, Leo was always cushioned, always bailed out, always given another chance. Usually at my expense, I continued. I remember when I applied for my first college scholarship. My parents spent weeks helping Leo write his personal statement for a school he didn't even get into, while I was told to figure it out myself. I did, of course. I got the scholarship. And do you know what my mother said? That's nice, dear. Now, can you help Leo with his car payment this month? My accomplishments were invisible, or worse. Opportunities for them to divert resources to Leo. This hit a nerve with many of my cousins, who had also experienced similar disparities in their own families. There were quiet murmurs of agreement. It wasn't just about money, though, I emphasized. It was about validation. It was about seeing, or rather, not seeing. My needs, my feelings, my dreams. They were always secondary to Leo's perceived struggles. His struggles were crises, requiring immediate collective intervention. Mine were just me being dramatic, I chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. I think the only time my mother truly saw me was when I was holding a checkbook open, ready to sign for Leo's latest mishap. Or when I was elbow deep in a clogged toilet at the cabin, fixing a problem Leo had created. The absurd image, delivered with my customary dry wit, elicited a few suppressed laughs, even from some of the more stoic relatives. And when I finally decided I'd had enough, I said, my voice softening slightly, but with an underlying steel. When I started setting boundaries, saying, no, small no's at first, like no, I can't lend you money for that obviously fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme, or no, I'm not going to mediate your argument with your landlord about the ferret smell. That's when I became the enemy. That's when I became difficult. That's when I became selfish. That's when I became not welcome. I held up the invitation card again, a silent, damning piece of evidence. This isn't just a birthday party, is it? It's a coronation for the family's preferred narrative, a celebration of their ability to maintain control, to dismiss anyone who deviates from their script. But here's the thing about scripts, I concluded, my voice rising slightly, filling the room with my conviction. Sometimes, the actor decides to improvise. Sometimes, the actor decides to speak their own lines. And sometimes, the actor decides to burn the whole theatre down. I met my mother's wide, horrified eyes. She looked like she was about to faint. My father was pale, his mouth agape. Leo stood frozen, his fury replaced by a deer-in-headlights terror. The room was utterly silent once more, waiting. And I knew, with a fierce certainty, that they would never, ever be able to rewrite this particular scene. The air crackled with the unsaid. The perfect, polished facade of the Miller family was not just cracking. It was in free fall, shards scattering across the expensive carpet. I could see the wheels turning in some relatives' minds, the sudden clarity as pieces of past conversations and unexplained incidents clicked into place. My mother, Eleanor, began to whimper, a high-pitched, almost theatrical sound designed to elicit sympathy. "Emma, you're upsetting everyone. This is cruel," she wailed. "Cruel," I countered, raising an eyebrow. "Is it cruel to speak the truth, Mother? Or is it cruel to foster a lifetime of dependency and then discard the one person who carried the weight of it all? Let's rewind a bit, shall we?" I continued, ignoring her protestations. "Think about the holidays. Every Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, I was always the one planning, organizing, cooking, cleaning up. While Leo would show up an hour late, eat half the turkey, and then disappear to take a call or check his fantasy football scores. And then, without fail, my parents would pull me aside and say, "Oh, Emma, thank you so much for all your help. We just wish Leo would settle down and be more like you." It was a backhanded compliment, a constant reminder that my value was tied to my labor, not my presence. My goodness was merely a stick to beat Leo with, while he remained immune to any real consequences. A few of the older matriarchs in the room, women who had undoubtedly lived similar thankless lives, nodded with grim understanding. "And then there's the subtle art of emotional blackmail," I explained, shifting my focus. My mother, a master of the helpless sigh, the teary phone call whenever I tried to assert any independence. "Oh, Emma, I just don't know what I'd do without you." Or, "Your father is so stressed with Leo's issues, we just need you to be there for us." It wasn't love, it was a leash, disguised as concern. Every attempt I made to build my own life, to pursue my own happiness, was met with resistance, thinly veiled guilt trips, and a sudden surge in their needs. I recalled countless times I'd cancelled plans with friends, postponed vacations, or put my career on hold because of an urgent, manufactured family crisis. It was a suffocating embrace, designed to keep me compliant and available. "My relationship with Mark, for instance," I said, gesturing to him, a silent tribute to his unwavering support. "My parents never fully accepted him. Not because there was anything wrong with him. He's kind, stable, successful, but because he was a threat to their control. He saw through their games. He validated my feelings. He encouraged me to set boundaries, and for that, he was deemed not good enough or too serious. They preferred a version of Emma who was perpetually single and available to cater to their whims. Anything that took me away from their orbit was viewed as a personal affront." Mark simply smiled, a quiet, reassuring presence. His existence was living proof of my liberation, and they hated it. "This reunion," I concluded, my voice resonating with a finality that brooked no argument, "is not just a party. It's a statement. A statement that I, Emma, am no longer playing your game. I am no longer the scapegoat, the ATM, or the emotional punching bag. You told me I wasn't welcome. But the truth is, you weren't ready for me to show up as my authentic self. You preferred the version of Emma you could control. Well, that Emma is gone. And this Emma," I swept my arm out, encompassing the shocked faces, "this Emma is free. And she has a whole lot more to say." The silence that followed was even heavier than before, pregnant with the weight of revelation. The fallout was immediate and, predictably, chaotic. My mother's whimper turned into genuine sobs, theatrical perhaps, but real enough to draw the attention of the waitstaff, who discreetly started hovering, unsure whether to offer tissues or security. My father, regaining some semblance of his composure, puffed out his chest and pointed a trembling finger at me. "You will leave this instant, Emma. You are a disgrace," he boomed, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "A disgrace?" I scoffed, a dark laugh bubbling up. "Father, I believe the word you're looking for is uncooperative, because for decades, I was your dutiful, silent, and financially solvent disgrace. Now I'm just uncooperative." Leo, always the volatile one, lunged forward, his face contorted with rage. "You ruined everything. This was supposed to be a good day." Mark, who had remained calm and collected, stepped subtly in front of me, placing a hand on Leo's chest, stopping him dead in his tracks. "That's enough, Leo," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, cutting through Leo's bluster. "Emma has a right to speak her truth, something your family has never allowed her to do." My brother tried to push past Mark, but Mark held his ground, his eyes unwavering. The physical confrontation, or near confrontation, sent another wave of shock through the already stunned guests. A few of the men, perhaps sensing a potential brawl, started to move closer, uncertainly. "You talk about ruining a good day," I said, stepping around Mark to face Leo directly, my voice low and cutting. "What about the decades of good days I lost? The opportunities I missed, the relationships that suffered, the peace of mind I sacrificed, all to prop up your endless failures and my parents' delusional belief that you're anything but an entitled leech." The words stung, and Leo actually reeled back, as if I had physically struck him. He was used to being coddled, not confronted with such brutal honesty. My parents gasped, horrified that I would speak to their golden child in such a manner. "This isn't about one day, Leo," I pressed on, pressing my advantage. "This is about a pattern of transactional relationships, a pattern of emotional manipulation, a pattern of financial exploitation. And it all culminated in you and Mom and Dad deciding I wasn't worthy of our grandparents' legacy, but you were. You, who couldn't even manage to keep a gerbil alive in elementary school, were deemed more responsible with a large sum of money than I was, the person who actually earned and saved it. The absurdity of the situation was almost comical, and I allowed myself a small, sarcastic smile. The comparison to the gerbil was an old family joke, known by many in the room, and it drew a few more nervous snickers. My father finally roared, "That's it! Get out! Get out of my party!" He was shaking with fury, his face purpling. "Oh, I'll go, father," I said, my voice sweet and deadly. "But not before everyone here understands exactly why you disinvited me. Not before they understand the true cost of your family values. And certainly not before they understand that your unpleasantness was nothing compared to the lifetime of quiet suffering you inflicted upon me. You wanted to avoid drama. Too late. You brewed the storm, and now you're standing in the middle of it." I took a deep breath, surveying the wreckage of their perfect reunion. It was glorious. The tension in the ballroom was so thick you could almost taste it. My father was practically vibrating with impotent rage, his face a mottled red. My mother continued her soft, dramatic whimpering, dabbing at her dry eyes with a pristine handkerchief. Leo stood frozen, his earlier fury replaced by a deer-in-headlights paralysis. I, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of calm, an almost detached serenity. It was the calm that comes after the storm has broken, when all the pent-up pressure has finally been released. "Let's be clear," I said, my voice ringing out, carrying easily over the stunned silence. "This isn't about seeking an apology. I stopped expecting that years ago. This is about establishing a new reality. A reality where your actions have consequences, and where my voice is heard, whether you like it or not." I looked towards my Aunt Martha, my mother's older sister, a woman who had always seemed to observe more than she spoke. She met my gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Think about the unspoken rules." I addressed the room. The silent agreements that dictate who gets favoured, who gets blamed, and who gets used. In our family, the rule was simple. Leo takes, Emma gives. And if Emma stops giving, she's punished. I paused, letting that sink in. That's not love. That's a transaction. And I'm withdrawing from that transaction. A low murmur spread through the room, as if people were finally articulating their own long-held suspicions. My parents always cultivated this image of being generous, loving, and supportive. I continued, a sardonic smile on my face. But it was always conditional, wasn't it? Conditional on my compliance, conditional on my silence, conditional on my willingness to be their personal ATM and emotional punching bag. You see, they didn't want a daughter. They wanted a resource. They didn't want a son. They wanted a project. And when the resource finally rebelled, and the project remained a perpetual failure, they chose the project. This cut deep, and I watched as Leo's face crumbled, the realization of his parents' true perception of him perhaps hitting him for the first time. He was just a project, a means to their end, not a person they genuinely cared for beyond their own self-serving narratives. "You invited everyone here to celebrate your version of success," I said, turning back to my parents, my voice now laced with bitter triumph. "The cabin sale, the fresh start for Leo, the perfect family image. But you forgot one crucial detail. You forgot that sometimes the person you've been exploiting the most has had enough. You forgot that silence isn't always agreement. Sometimes it's just the calm before the storm. And you, mother, father, Leo, you are standing in the eye of that storm." My voice dropped to a near whisper, but its intensity pulled everyone closer. "You told me I wasn't welcome, but I made myself welcome. Not with your invitation, but with my truth. And that, unlike your carefully curated image, is something that cannot be bought or sold." The silence returned, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just shock, it was contemplation. It was the sound of people rethinking their perceptions, reevaluating their relationships. My parents looked utterly defeated, their power drained, their authority evaporated. Leo, surprisingly, still seemed more stunned than angry, perhaps grappling with the harsh reality I had just presented. Mark, my unwavering ally, stepped forward, his arm gently circling my waist. "I think," he said, his voice quiet but carrying perfectly, "we've said what needed to be said." It was a cue, a signal that the performance was over. My purpose had been served. With Mark's quiet pronouncement, the spell began to break. The frozen tableau of the Miller family started to thaw, but not into warmth. Instead, it was a messy, uncomfortable scramble. My father, still looking bewildered, tried to grab my arm, muttering, "Emma, this is absurd. Think about what you're doing." I easily sidestepped him, my gaze firm. "I have thought about it, father, for years. And this is the culmination of that thought process. You reap what you sow." He recoiled, his hand dropping. My mother had dissolved into full-blown, albeit still dramatic, sobs, attracting the concerned attention of a few distant cousins who hadn't heard the full story. Leo, perhaps for the first time in his life, looked utterly lost, staring at his parents as if they were strangers. The golden child was seeing his gilded cage for what it was. "We're leaving now," I announced, my voice clear and decisive, the ringmaster concluding her act. "But before we do, I want everyone to understand one thing." I looked directly at the crowd, my voice gaining a raw, emotional edge. For years, I was told that family meant unconditional love. What I experienced was conditional manipulation. I was told that family meant support. What I experienced was constant extraction. I was told that family meant a safe haven. What I experienced was a battlefield where I was always the primary target. The words resonated, striking a chord with anyone who had ever felt exploited by those who claimed to love them. My strength, which they so readily praised, was simply their justification for never having to lift a finger themselves. I continued, my voice unwavering. My capacity to handle anything became their excuse to dump everything on me. My quiet nature was interpreted as compliance. But silence, as I've learned, can be the loudest form of protest, especially when it finally breaks. I paused, letting the power of that statement sink in. And today, my silence broke, spectacularly. A few brave souls in the room nodded. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, Sarah, offered a small, sympathetic smile. It was a lifeline, a tiny thread of connection to a healthier future. "So, as you enjoy the rest of this celebration," I said, a sarcastic edge to my voice as I surveyed the lavish spread, "perhaps take a moment to consider the hidden costs. The invisible sacrifices. The people who were quietly exploited so others could shine. Because a family built on one person's constant giving and others' constant taking isn't a family. It's an enterprise. And I, for one, am no longer a shareholder." With that, I took Mark's hand, a firm, grounding presence beside me. We turned and began to walk, slowly, deliberately, towards the ballroom doors. Every step felt like a victory march. The murmurs behind us erupted into a cacophony of confused chatter, panicked whispers, and the insistent wail of my mother. We didn't look back. As we reached the doors, I caught a glimpse of my father, clutching his chest, his face ashen. My mother was being consoled by a bewildered aunt. And Leo, still standing near the bar, looked smaller, diminished, his golden aura tarnished beyond repair. The grand reunion, meant to be a triumph, had become their public reckoning. And I, the uninvited guest, had been the one to deliver it. The relief that washed over me as we stepped out into the cool evening air was immense, a cleansing wave after years of stagnant bitterness. It was over. The game was finally over. Stepping out of the country club, the cool evening air felt like a balm on my skin, washing away the lingering heat of confrontation. Mark pulled me into a tight hug, his embrace a silent affirmation of all that had just transpired. "You did it, Em," he murmured, his voice thick with pride. "You really did it." And for the first time in my life, standing there, free from the suffocating weight of their expectations, I truly believed him. The quiet drive home was punctuated by a few deep breaths and a profound sense of peace. No frantic calls, no angry texts. Yet, just the hum of the engine and the quiet certainty that a seismic shift had occurred. The days that followed were surprisingly calm, like the eye of a hurricane before the second band of storms hits. My phone was eerily silent from my parents and Leo. I half expected a barrage of angry messages, desperate apologies, or renewed attempts at gaslighting. But there was nothing. It was disconcerting in its quietness, a stark contrast to the decades of relentless emotional demands. Mark suggested they were either too shocked to react or strategizing their next move. I suspected a bit of both. The silence, however, was a luxury I hadn't known existed. I spent the time reclaiming pieces of myself I hadn't even realized were missing. I called old friends, pursued hobbies I'd abandoned, and simply reveled in the quiet freedom of my own space, unburdened by their constant presence. Then came the first indirect contact. It was Aunt Susan, the aforementioned gossip queen, who called me. She didn't mention the reunion directly, but her voice was unusually subdued, almost respectful. She talked about the weather, about her cat, then, casually. "So, Eleanor's been a bit quiet lately. And Richard? Haven't seen Leo around either." It was her subtle way of fishing for information and confirming the widespread impact of my outburst. I just smiled. "Oh? I wouldn't know, Aunt Susan. I haven't heard from them." The truth, delivered with polite indifference, seemed to fluster her. "Well," she huffed, "I suppose some things are better left unsaid. Or," I countered, "some things are better said, just not by the people you expect." She quickly changed the subject, clearly uncomfortable. But the message was clear. My words had resonated. Other subtle signs emerged. A distant cousin, whom I rarely spoke to, sent me a cryptic text. Glad someone finally said it. An old family friend, usually fiercely loyal to my parents, made a point of seeking me out at a charity event, offering genuine condolences about the cabin. The narrative was shifting. The truth, once confined to my private torment, was now a public conversation, quietly spreading through the extended family network. My parents' carefully curated image of a loving, harmonious family was being scrutinized, and for many, it simply didn't hold up under the new light I had shone on it. It was vindication, quiet but potent. My mother eventually tried to send me a text, a rambling, tearful message about misunderstandings and family always finding a way back. It was the same old song and dance, but this time, it fell flat. It felt hollow, devoid of its usual power. I didn't respond. Leo, meanwhile, attempted to call me, probably to yell, but I let it go, to voicemail. His message was a garbled mix of anger, self-pity, and a demand for an explanation. He still didn't get it. He probably never would. But that was no longer my problem. My liberation was complete, the boundaries firmly established, and the silence, once a terrifying prospect, had become my most cherished peace. The second wave of the hurricane, as Mark had predicted, eventually hit. It wasn't a direct assault, but a series of calculated maneuvers, designed to restore their narrative and undermine mine. My mother, incapable of a direct, honest confrontation, resorted to the classic passive-aggressive maneuver. She started talking about me through other relatives. Phone calls to my aunts and uncles became thinly veiled therapy sessions, where she lamented my sudden change, my cruelty, and how Emma just isn't herself anymore. The aim was to paint me as unstable, ungrateful, and emotionally disturbed, thereby discrediting everything I had said at the reunion. "She used to be such a sweet girl," I heard through the grapevine, courtesy of Aunt Susan's inability to keep a secret. "I don't know what's gotten into her. Maybe Mark is a bad influence." The attempt to blame Mark was particularly infuriating, but also a sign of their desperation. They couldn't fault me for finally standing up, so they had to find an external scapegoat. My father, with his usual strategic mind, began circulating a slightly altered version of events, glossing over the cabin sale details and focusing instead on my unprovoked outburst at his birthday party. He emphasized how embarrassed they were, implying that I was the cause of the family's current discomfort, not their decades of manipulation. Leo, true to form, resorted to outright childishness. He unfriended me on social media, then refriended me, then posted vague, self-pitying statuses about toxic people and unnecessary drama. It was almost endearing in its predictability. He was attempting to garner sympathy from our shared acquaintances, portraying himself as the long-suffering victim of my irrational anger. Some people just want to burn bridges. One of his posts read, clearly aimed at me, conveniently forgetting who had actually struck the match and supplied the accelerant. But their efforts were largely in vain. The seed of truth I had planted at the reunion had taken root. Many of my relatives, who had witnessed my parents' and Leo's behaviour over the years, found my narrative more credible than their flimsy counter-arguments. Aunt Martha, for instance, called me directly, not to gossip, but to express genuine sympathy. "Emma," she said, her voice gentle, "I always wondered what was going on. I just never had the full picture. I'm so sorry you went through that." Her validation was immense, a quiet victory that far outweighed my mother's public lamentations. Even some of my father's more reserved siblings started subtly distancing themselves from him, no longer as quick to accept his version of reality. I chose not to engage with their smear campaign. I didn't send retaliatory texts, didn't post passive-aggressive replies on social media. I simply lived my life, openly and authentically. My silence spoke volumes. It signaled confidence, not weakness. It showed that I didn't need to defend myself against their fabricated narratives, because the truth, for those willing to see it, was already out there. Their attempts to rewrite the script failed because I had already performed the play. And the audience, it turned out, was paying attention. The consequences of my defiance were unfolding, not as a quick explosion, but as a slow, inevitable re-evaluation of our entire family dynamic. The true consequences for them began to manifest not in grand, dramatic gestures, but in the insidious erosion of their influence and the quiet fracturing of their social circles. My parents, who had always thrived on being the central figures of the extended family, found themselves increasingly sidelined. Invites to distant relatives' gatherings became less frequent. Phone calls, once constant, became sporadic and formal. The endless stream of relatives dropping by for coffee or a chat slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. Their carefully cultivated image of generosity and benevolence, once their primary tool of control, was now openly questioned. I heard through the grapevine again. "Thank you, Aunt Susan," who was now less a gossip and more a reluctant informant, that my mother was distraught. "No one is calling me anymore, Emma," she apparently wailed to one of her sisters. "They're all being so distant. I don't know why." The lack of self-awareness was astounding, almost comical. She genuinely couldn't connect her public humiliation and the exposure of her lifelong manipulative patterns to the sudden chill in her social life. My father, ever the pragmatist, was more furious than sad. He saw the loss of his empire, the dwindling number of people he could impress or subtly control. His power, once absolute within his immediate circle, was diminished. Leo, predictably, suffered the most immediate and tangible consequences. The fresh start money from the cabin sale, predictably, vanished faster than a snowflake in hell. His latest business venture, something vaguely involving artisanal dog treats and a questionable multi-level marketing scheme, collapsed within months. But this time, there was no safety net. My parents, reeling from their own social isolation, and perhaps finally seeing the writing on the wall, were less inclined to bail him out. And I, of course, was no longer an option. Leo was forced to get a real job, something he hadn't done consistently in years, and the adjustment was, from what I heard, brutally humbling. He even had to move into a tiny, run-down apartment, a stark contrast to his usual lifestyle subsidized by my parents and, unknowingly, me. The silence from their end, once a terrifying prospect, became my greatest peace. It wasn't just physical silence. It was the silence of their demands, their expectations, their guilt trips. My phone no longer buzzed with urgent requests for money or emotional support. My calendar was no longer dictated by their manufactured crises. I had space. I had time. And most importantly, I had my own life, free from their shadow. Mark and I thrived. Our relationship, once strained by the constant emotional drainage from my family, blossomed. We went on weekend trips, invested in our home, and built a future based on mutual respect and genuine support, not transactional obligation. The vindication wasn't a sudden burst of triumph, but a steady, quiet hum of contentment. It was seeing my mother's desperation, my father's impotent rage, and Leo's forced self-sufficiency. It was the knowledge that my truth, once ridiculed, had become their reality. They had told me I wasn't welcome, and in doing so, they had inadvertently opened the door for my own liberation, for the real Emma to finally emerge from the shadows of their dysfunction. The reunion, meant to be their celebration, became the launching pad for my freedom. The true measure of my liberation wasn't just the absence of their demands, but the profound shift in my own self-perception. For so long, I had defined myself by my utility to them, by my ability to solve their problems, to maintain their peace, to absorb their chaos. Now, with those chains severed, I was discovering who Emma truly was, outside of their narrative. It was exhilarating, like shedding a heavy cloak I hadn't realized I was wearing for decades. I found myself pursuing interests I'd long since abandoned. I rediscovered my love for hiking, spending weekends exploring trails with Mark, feeling the wind on my face, a tangible sense of freedom. I took painting classes, something I'd always dreamed of but never had the time for, realizing just how much of my time had been consumed by their manufactured crises. My relationship with Mark deepened profoundly. He wasn't just my partner. He was my unwavering ally, my voice of reason, the mirror that reflected back to me the truth of my situation when I was too close to see it clearly. He celebrated my small victories, soothed my lingering anxieties, and simply listened when I needed to process years of buried resentment. We built our home together, brick by brick, not just physically but emotionally, creating a sanctuary where honesty and mutual respect were the cornerstones. It was a stark contrast to the hollow, conditional love I had known from my family. The most surprising development was the re-establishment of contact with certain relatives who had, for years, remained silent observers. My Aunt Martha, who had previously been sympathetic but hesitant, became a quiet supporter. She started inviting me for coffee, not to gossip, but to genuinely connect. She confessed that she had always suspected the family dynamics were skewed, but had been too intimidated by my parents to speak up. "You were so brave, Emma," she said one afternoon, her eyes filled with admiration. "You said what so many of us felt, but never dared to voice." Her words were a validation, not just of my actions at the reunion, but of my entire experience. Even some of my cousins, Leo's peers, began reaching out. They spoke of Leo's recent struggles, his newfound humility, and the stark reality check he was experiencing. It wasn't schadenfreude, but a quiet acknowledgement of the cosmic balance being restored. They had always seen Leo's easy ride, but now they were seeing the consequences of a life lived without genuine effort or accountability. The truth, once confined to my bitter observations, was now part of the wider family consensus. The vindication was quiet, but it was everywhere. I learned that true peace doesn't come from avoiding conflict or keeping quiet. It comes from speaking your truth, setting boundaries, and allowing the chips to fall where they may. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it often means losing people you thought were essential. But the space they leave behind is fertile ground for genuine connections, for self-discovery, and for a kind of liberation that is priceless. My family had told me I wasn't welcome, and in that rejection, they had inadvertently handed me the keys to my own freedom. It was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. Looking back, the reunion feels like a distant dream, a pivotal moment that irrevocably altered the trajectory of my life. It was a bomb, certainly, but a controlled detonation, carefully aimed to dismantle the toxic structures that had held me captive. The immediate aftermath was chaotic, yes, but the long-term effects have been nothing short of miraculous. My parents, after the initial shock and their brief, clumsy attempts at damage control, mostly retreated into their own world. They continued their narrative of being wronged, of having an ungrateful daughter, but it was a narrative whispered only to each other, losing its power without an audience to validate it. They lost significant social standing within the wider family, and that, for them, was a punishment far more severe than any financial loss. Leo, after his initial struggle, actually started to mature, albeit slowly and reluctantly. The forced independence, the need to genuinely work for what he wanted, seemed to chip away at some of his ingrained entitlement. I heard he was still prone to flashes of self-pity, but the constant bailing out had stopped, and that alone was a monumental shift. He was no longer the golden child, forever protected. He was just another adult, accountable for his own life. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was progress. And it was progress born directly from the consequences I had initiated. I felt no triumph in his struggles, only a quiet, detached satisfaction that the cycle had finally been broken. My own life, meanwhile, continued to flourish. Mark and I got married in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by friends and the few family members who genuinely supported us, Aunt Martha being one of them. Her presence a silent testament to the changing tides. There were no dramatic family appearances, no last-minute attempts to sabotage the day. It was peaceful, joyous, and entirely ours. It was everything a wedding should be, built on a foundation of respect and genuine connection, not obligation or performance. We recently welcomed our first child, a beautiful daughter, and the thought of raising her in an environment free from the kind of manipulation I grew up with fills me with an overwhelming sense of purpose and joy. I still encounter my parents occasionally, at funerals or other unavoidable family events. The interactions are brief, polite, and emotionally sterile. There are no grand reconciliations, no tearful apologies. They haven't fundamentally changed, but I have. I no longer carry the burden of their expectations, the weight of their judgment. I no longer feel the need to justify my existence or prove my worth. Their silence is no longer a punishment, it's a blessing. My strength, once their instrument, is now entirely my own, used to build a life filled with authenticity, joy, and healthy boundaries. The story isn't one of pure, unadulterated revenge. It's a story of reclamation, of a quiet bomb finally detonating, clearing the wreckage of a toxic past to make way for a future built on my terms. They told me I wasn't welcome. And by trying to erase me, they accidentally gave me the ultimate gift. The freedom to define family for myself, on my own terms, filled with people who genuinely value and respect me. And that, dear friends, is a reunion I'll always be welcome at. So, there it is. The full, unvarnished truth. The story of how Emma, the long-suffering, endlessly accommodating daughter, finally broke free from the psychological chains that had bound her for decades. It's a story of a slow, insidious boil, of a catalyst who finally opened my eyes, and of a public reckoning that, while terrifying, was ultimately the most liberating act of my life. I often wonder if they truly understood, in the aftermath, the extent of the damage they had inflicted, not just with the cabin, but with the years of emotional neglect and financial exploitation. My guess? Probably not. Their worldviews are too entrenched, their self-perception too carefully guarded. They likely still see themselves as the victims of an ungrateful daughter who caused a scene. And honestly, at this point, that's perfectly fine by me. Their narrative, their problem. My life now is a testament to the power of setting boundaries, of choosing yourself, and of understanding that not all blood is thicker than water. Sometimes, it's just thicker because it's stagnant. The peace I feel now is profound, a quiet hum of contentment that settles deep in my bones. It's the freedom of not walking on eggshells, of not constantly bracing for the next manufactured crisis. It's the joy of building a life with Mark, a partner who sees me, truly sees me, and celebrates me for who I am, not for what I can provide. It's the quiet satisfaction of watching my daughter grow up in a home where her feelings are validated, where her worth is inherent, and where she will never be compared or pitted against a sibling. That, more than anything, is my true vindication. The old Emma, the one who tried so desperately to earn their love and approval, sometimes whispers in the quiet corners of my mind. A phantom limb of guilt, a fleeting moment of sadness for what could have been. But then the new Emma, stronger and wiser, reminds her that what could have been was merely a continuation of the same old cycle, and that breaking free, however painful, was the only path to genuine happiness. The personal grievance storytelling isn't about wallowing. It's about processing, about sharing, and about finding solidarity with others who have walked similar paths. This isn't just my story. It's a story many of you, I suspect, can relate to. The family dynamics, the favoritism, the gaslighting, the quiet suffering. It's a universal struggle, played out in countless homes every day. So, as you listen, as you reflect, I have to ask you, my confidants, my audience, did I go too far or not far enough? Was the public exposure justified, or should I have retreated quietly? Was this an act of necessary self-preservation, or a moment of understandable, if aggressive, retaliation? Let me know in the comments. Your judgment, your perspective, is part of this journey. And perhaps, in sharing my experience, it might just give someone else the courage to finally write their own ending. Because sometimes, the only way to heal is to burn the bridge that leads you back to your pain. And then, darling, you build a brand new one, leading straight to your freedom.